Hello, and welcome to Open Wounds Podcast. I'm your host, Candace. This podcast is about healing the wounds that you can't see and leading a revolution against oppressive systems that keep them open. We're going to talk about really practical tools for managing complex PTSD, as well as dive into relevant current day topics that make healing a daily practice. You can follow us at IG at Open Wounds Podcast or watch on YouTube at Open Wounds Podcast. Please rate, review, like, subscribe, all the things, and enjoy this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Open Wounds Podcast. I have a guest today. Her name is Tess CRHE. She is, I believe it's the CEO, or is it the COO, one of those titles for counseling, Coalition for Responsible Homeschooling. And she's here today to talk to us about something I'm very passionate about, which is homeschool reform and homeschool awareness, and something I think a lot of people don't even think about, especially in today's society where everything feels like a crisis. So welcome, Tess. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about the work that we do as more and more people kind of discover homeschooling even exists, right?
Yeah. So do you want to share a little bit about your personal background, like what led you to become involved with this coalition and why you were passionate about this work?
Yeah. So the organization I represent, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, we have been around since 2013. And what makes our organization really, really unique in the larger homeschool landscape is that we're an organization that is actually founded by homeschool alumni and continues to be led by homeschool alumni as well. In so many conversations, about social issues, we lean on lived experience, right? We talk about how important it is to consider lived experience. And we're the homeschooling organization that actually has that lived experience. It's interesting when you sort of zoom out and you think about the way that we talk about homeschooling. So much of that conversation is focused on a parent's right to homeschool, but we like to come at it actually from the children's rights perspective as well. We're not an anti-homeschooling organization, but we are a pro-oversight organization, which means that we believe that homeschooling has a very necessary place in the United States education system, but there need to be some guardrails up around it.
Yeah, I think partially my personal experience with homeschooling is why I'm so passionate about this, because I saw like the way, because you're in a homeschooling co-op, or at least I was, you could see kind of like, oh, this person has curriculum that their parents ordered and they have a whole set of books that they're following. You have people who weren't doing any books at all. And it was like unschooling is another term we could talk about that's come up in recent years, where people are just against traditional education altogether, but they're using homeschooling as a way to pull their kids out of it. So I guess to start at the top, I think what most people don't understand is that there are especially in the United States, little to no regulation federally on homeschooling, and state to state it varies. So can you talk a little bit about like how homeschooling is just kind of like this wild west of like whatever the parent wants to do with their kid?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love the Wild West analogy because it truly is what homeschooling looks like. So I think that depending on what people's interactions with homeschooling can be, there's a lot of assumptions made about it. Maybe that, families are following a curriculum, that there's some kind of assessment progress. But the truth of the matter is, in the majority of states, families don't even need to check in with teachers having a curriculum approved or even notify the state that they're actually homeschooling. So when we sort of zoom out and look at that, it concerns us, of course, from a child welfare lens, right? As soon as the way that our society is set up is that a lot of resources and a lot of access for children comes through the public school system. Once children are removed from that public school system, they're no longer seeing mandatory reporters. Even things like food insecurity, that a lot of that is, again, addressed through the public school. So from a child welfare perspective, there's kind of this unique thing that happens when children are withdrawn to be homeschooled. And on the other side of that, because states treat homeschoolers so much differently, a lot of times homeschoolers can kind of de facto be isolated, and they are so othered in this that they don't have the same opportunities as other children. So a lot of the work and the advocacy that we do actually surrounds just a children's right to an open future. So when we think about what that open future looks like, there are states who allow homeschoolers, for example, to access public school libraries, sports, extracurriculars. And that's one way that, we see it of course, benefiting homeschooled, of course, benefiting children, but also an important kind of safety measure. So what we would like to see is all states step up a little bit more and take a little bit more care of some of their most vulnerable constituents. But the reality is that the parents' conversation is so strong in this that it's almost impossible to get past.
Yeah, which brings us to kind of like we had talked a little bit off camera about prior to the early 90s, homeschooling was illegal in a lot of states, which I don't think people understand. So, can you talk about like why it used to be illegal and then how it became okay for people to take their kids out of school and educate them at home?
Yeah. So not all states, but a lot of states have this piece in their statute that says every child in the state of Connecticut, for example, has the right to a public education or the equivalent. And so what that means is that children in that state have a right to an education. And that means a lot of things. It means that they have a lot of different subjects to explore. They have those really important social connections. They have all of these pieces that make up that make up an open future. That's written into some state constitutions, and it's not written into other state constitutions. So depending on how people interpreted that, homeschooling became a really interesting sort of phenomena because the default was to send your children to school. You know, in the 70s, there absolutely were homeschoolers. They were working really closely in concert with the public school system because homeschooling was the best choice for their, you know, their kids, whatever the reason was, and these children learned better at home. But it was a really symbiotic relationship, and I think it reflected more of the community care that should be present for all children. Then what happened was, you know, as homeschooling was kind of is still in this nebulous range, there was an opportunity there. There was an opportunity for individuals who work, especially in the Christian nationalism movement, to instead of using this vehicle to provide sort of a really interesting and unique educational opportunity, homeschooling itself became a vehicle where they could sort of pull in and isolate and keep children away from the public school system, thinking that the public school system was bad, right? So that is when homeschooling, which was previously illegal unless you had a really strong connection with the public school system, it systematically became deregulated and legal across the country really quickly. So I myself was homeschooled in the early 90s, right when it first became legal in the state of Michigan. And at that point, truly, the floodgates were opened. And it really was, and the organization that was instrumental in deregulating homeschooling at that time, opportunistically for the Christian right, remains in charge of the anti-regulation lobby to this day.
Yeah, so we talked about that. It's HSLDA. Can you share what HSLDA stands for? I know there was a guy who founded it and has like spearheaded it, and they have a bunch of attorneys in their pockets. Like, I think most people don't get that this homeschooling movement, because a lot of think, you know, people are like, oh, maybe it was hippies who think that the establishment is brainwashing their kids, or they don't realize that it is very heavily influenced by the evangelicals and the Christians and these people who started perceiving, like my parents did, that the public school system was indoctrinating your children into like worldly, you know, values that they didn't want their kids having, and that they sought that God wanted to protect their children and their innocence, and therefore they were going to pull them out of the school system and homeschool them. So can you talk a little bit about the guy who started the HSLDA and what his agenda is, because it's still going strong to this day, decades and decades later?
Yeah, and so a lot of that, a lot of the agenda is rooted, you know, in the parents' rights movement. Is really kind of, and I know that that goes in waves, and we hear about it a lot sometimes, depending regionally on where we are. I know for myself in Michigan, parents' rights kind of had a resurgence a couple of years ago when there was a massive takeover of school boards here, right? And a lot of that was couched within that, you know, parents' rights movement. And the parents have a right to do whatever they want with their children, right? Children are not considered citizens or really full people yet. They're essentially property, and they are essentially property of their parents. And within that ideology is really where a lot of that deregulation from homeschooling comes from. And so the agenda there really was to ensure that parents retain those ultimate rights, and the best way to do that was to remove children from the public school system and potentially learning about other belief systems, other opportunities, other ways of living. It's keeping a movement moving forward, right? I don't know what
Mhm.
a way to say that is. So When CRHE, the organization I represent, came up in the conversation, we were really centered on the absolute opposite of that, on children's rights. It's one of my favorite kind of reframings in this education conversation is to say, okay, great. Children's, education is about children, right? So let's center children's rights to an education, to access, even to things like healthcare, documentation. All of those are important rights for children. But when we center the parents' rights conversation, it looks like that, again, just Wild West kind of systematic deregulation of homeschooling that does exist to this day.
Yeah, I think the parents' rights versus children's rights things is one of the things I get really upset about because I have worked in social work and I have seen the child welfare system from kind of several different angles. And the right to education and the fact that children have no rights in the United States of America, and that's not the same as other countries around the world. And so when we're talking about like my 10-year-old, he's like, well, I should have the right to this and I should have the right to that. And I was like, technically, you can't vote, you can't open a bank account. Like there's a lot of things that he's asking me about. And I was like, well, it's not because I don't want this for you. It's like legally, you're not allowed to do these things. Like, and he's like, why? That's not fair. I should have rights and da 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 da. I was like, call your politicians, write a letter. Like, I don't know what to tell you because the parents' rights movement and the HSLDA has been so effective, depressingly so, honestly. Like, the fact that they have made such strong inroads. And I think it's in an area that most people don't pay any attention to. Like, they don't get what's going on and that this is a very clear agenda to control children and use them as pawns in a future thing. I know there's been some documentaries about these large Christian organizations and how they've tried to like basically use children as the future generation of their movement, right? Which I find hilarious because as you see these families with have large amounts of kids, like you can look at the Duggars or whoever, and they as the kids age out, they're kind of like, this is crazy. I am not sticking with this. Like some of them will stick around, but there's a large majority of the kids who are like, I don't want to be involved in what my parents were doing or things like that. So, but we were talking a little bit about like, so when we're talking about children's rights and parents' rights and the fact that kids don't have any rights in the United States, can you talk how, because you were homeschooled in the US, but you also lived abroad and you got to go to school in other countries and you kind of got to see what like children's rights look like in other countries. And now in your position, you can show like, hey, in the US, this is what's happening for kids. And in other countries, especially developed nations, these are the rights that children have. So can you talk a little bit about how US is like so far behind globally for this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm exceptionally proud that CRHE was able to contribute to the UNESCO report on homeschooling in the context of the world, right? And so we were able to contribute to this report and say, hey, here's how homeschooling is treated in the United States, as mostly a sort of hands-off parents' choice. There's no sort of community vigilance around homeschooled children, and that is so different than the rest of the world. Like you mentioned, my family moved overseas and back quite a bit when I was younger, and we went to school in Germany because homeschooling was illegal in Germany at that time. And I think it just reflects a little bit, And I was privileged to grow up with kind of a global experience, right? And then when I was able to come into this work, it really, even that somewhat limited scope really informed how we talk about homeschooling here, because I think in the United States we tend to pride ourselves, we think we're the most forward, the most free. But then when you look at how we treat homeschooling children and truly how devalued homeschooling children are in the larger context of the world, it's really, really impactful to see how we measure up. It's not good. We don't measure up well. It's like spoiler alert to anyone who is going to read, who was going to dive through that report. We don't measure up very well. And I think that, organizations like HSLDA, and what HSLDA stands for is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. There are organizations that work, both in concert with HSLDA and HSLDA themselves. And they are so dedicated to preserving the lack of regulation now, and even breaking that down even further. So what HSLDA will do is, as soon as there's any question, or I would like to say even perceived threat, these aren't even threats about a family homeschooling, they jump in with as much legal muscle as they have behind them to make sure that the families, of course, can keep homeschooling, but even more concerning, that the children stay out of the eyes of anyone except their parents and HSLDA.
Yeah, which I think is so weird because as a parent, if I were to choose to homeschool my child today, I wouldn't have any issue with a teacher looking over my curriculum or mandated doctor appointments or dentist visits or a child welfare person talking to my kid a couple times a year because I want what's best for my kid. Like that's what's glaringly weird to me about this HSLDA and their agenda and their movement is that like I feel like any normal parent would be totally fine with the amount of regulations that have been brought forward in states or things like that. But they're just so against any regulations whatsoever for annual testing or, you know, any type of oversight of what the curriculum's being taught. I think you can look at I always forget the name of the children that were in California, and there was quite a few of them, and the oldest one was like in her 30s, and they were basically held hostage by their parents under the guise of homeschooling. But California is one of the most progressive states where it does have regulations, and they still were able to have no oversight over these kids. And so I think the fact that they're fighting against any sort of regulations to me is like, well, what are you hiding? It's almost like, you're protesting so much. What's the deal here? Because I think a lot of people who care about children as a community and as us as a society, and we want, because I know just because that kid next door isn't my child doesn't mean I don't want them growing up in a toxic, hostile, abusive environment because then that perpetuates all these bad statistics where we see crime or we see, domestic violence or we see other things happening that we don't want as a community, right? So you guys' work has been to kind of like do what you can in the moment to counteract what HSLDA is? Or like, how is that working as you're seeing these like things come up in the states or counties or things like that where they're wanting to regulate it and then the HSLDA is coming in and throwing up a big, huge fit?
Yeah. So you brought up some of the great things that we advocate for, right? We advocate for those check-ins, sort of those assessments, some of the protections around children too. It's a scary word, but we do say parental qualifier. And what that means is that if a parent's convicted of a crime against children, they shouldn't be allowed to homeschool.
Yeah.
We
I think
and
people don't get that. They're like, what? You can
What
like,
qualifier do you mean?
yeah,
That's the
like
qualifier I mean.
Yeah, like you cannot be a registered sex offender and homeschool your kids. You cannot have like a criminal, you know what I mean? Like there there's so many states where if you are being investigated by child welfare, you can literally just pull your kids out of school so that your teachers can't report on you anymore. There was a book called A Child Called It where the teacher was the reason why child welfare got investigated because the kid was being severely abused. But yeah, there's no regulations. Like you can literally take your kids out of school, move to another state, and then no one knows where these kids went. And you don't have to tell anybody where you went and what you're doing with the kids.
Yeah, and I think that you know, that creates the opportunity for the worst of the worst in homeschooling.
Yeah.
Homeschooling is it's definitely a spectrum. There are these really horrific cases that we hear about on the news, and then there's some really, really great outcomes too. There's a whole stretch of, experiences in between that too. And what's so difficult about these conversations is when we're putting in these recommendations for policy that are, we would say, common sense regulations, right, to
Right.
kind of protect children. Our goal is to be protecting the children who need it the most, the children who realistically are the victims of non-purposeful homeschooling. There is purposeful homeschooling, and it has a really, frankly, has a really necessary spot, especially in a lot of school districts where neurodivergent kids are not being served, where queer kids are not safe. Homeschooling is important. And when we're talking about that, we like to say it's purposeful homeschooling, right? There is a
Hmm.
purpose, there's a reason. Everyone's kind of bought into it. But the problem is these bad actors in homeschooling that essentially use homeschooling as a veil for abuse and
Yeah.
neglect because we've removed the children from those systems. The problem is there's no word for this type of homeschooler versus this type of homeschooler.
Mhm.
Everyone's a homeschooler. So when we're talking about homeschool policy, it does mean that, even purposeful homeschoolers who are doing it for all the right reasons and have every best intention would still need the same type of check-ins. It's kind of like at a public school, right? Every child has the same privileges, has the same rights, and even has the same challenges. And we're just trying to apply that to homeschooling too. It's not an attack on people who are purposefully homeschooling
Right.
by any means, but everybody's got to play along here.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point where what we saw the increase in homeschooling post pandemic, right? Obviously, everyone was forced to homeschool during the pandemic and kind of a rude awakening about how much work teachers do and the services they provide to us as a society. But what we saw in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and a lot of this, I'm forgetting what the acronym is, but like they kept taking curriculum out of schools and the book bans and the stuff we saw where they were saying, oh, you can't teach about, gender and you can't teach about these certain aspects of history. I know that Texas and Florida were hot in all those areas of like taking a bunch of stuff out of the schools and
and
telling,
putting stuff in, right? We were posting the 10 commandments. We were like, there
right.
was
Yeah.
a lot of
So
stuff was going on.
yeah,
Yeah.
we saw a lot of people who wouldn't normally be drawn to homeschooling suddenly say, I need to keep my kids home because they're Black and I feel like they're going to be targeted. Or you talked a little bit about the families that are in the Sandy Hook district when we were off camera about them feeling like their kids are not safe to go to school because of mass shootings. And so there's very valid reasons now, especially what we're seeing with ICE happening and this cultural movement against trans kids where certain families feel like my kid is not safe in a public school environment and I need to homeschool him. But I think that these families, when you have connected with them, and we've talked a little bit about this off camera, is they are all for regulations and curriculum requirements and check-ins. And that's why I think that it's so crazy that we even have to have an agency like Counseling for Responsible Home Education, because it seems like such a no-brainer. Like a parent that loves and cares for their kids would want the best for them and would want these educational requirements and standards and would want some sort of feedback, right? So can you talk a little bit about how the homeschooling rates have increased since 2020 and why we're seeing people pull their kids out to homeschool them?
Yeah. It's one of our favorite things to talk about at CRHE because homeschooling in the way that a lot of us understood it as alumni and alumni in the professional space now. So,
Yeah.
30 and up a little bit here.
Yeah.
But, we knew homeschooling, and I think most people assume homeschooling is religiously motivated, is white, is, middle class, upper middle class, is kind of where homeschooling historically has lived, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there's so many stereotypes even about homeschoolers.
Yeah.
My sisters and I even joke about, people when they meet us that they say, when people tell us they're normal, that we're normal, when they meet us, they couldn't even tell we were homeschooled. We're like,
Yeah.
okay, good.
Thanks.
The allegations, you know what I mean? But, that's what we think of homeschoolers, right? And that's kind of
Right.
this, as society, what we're predisposed to think of a homeschooler as. But the reality is that is really, really changing. Homeschooling used to be maybe 2% of kids. Like it was very, very low.
Yeah.
In some states, that's almost 9% of children now.
Wow.
And so it is a massive shift upward in the volume of homeschooling, but in the diversity of homeschooling as well. Delaware just came out with some interesting statistics that 12% of children being homeschooled in Delaware now are Black. When we think again about what sort of our proclivity to who
Right.
a homeschooler is really, really changing. The other thing that we see is that homeschoolers move in and out of the school system a lot more now.
Mm.
Traditionally, homeschoolers were, never went to school, homeschooled all the way, K through 12. I think even, when we participate in some of these like slightly older alumni circles, that's really an experience that a lot of people have. But
Yeah.
now homeschooling might be used for a year or two, and then the children go back to school. And maybe it's a good fit for this sibling now, but the other siblings in school. And so what's interesting about this new generation of homeschoolers, right, is there's more familiarity with school systems and the resources that school systems are able to offer. So there's a little bit more openness to collaborating with them, and also just a recognition of, how many different ways that homeschooling can serve people. So I think that we have a genuine opportunity though now as homeschooling is opening up and more people are jumping on the homeschooling bandwagon, we have an opportunity now to put some of these safeguards and some of these measures in place. But we also have a really interesting opportunity for education on both sides of the conversation. More people need to know about the realities of homeschooling, good, bad, and otherwise. And we also need to get better about telling homeschoolers what the reality of public schools are. I'm a public school parent myself. It's
Yeah, I think that's
it's not that scary.
yeah. I think partially, like, I can say from my experience with my older son, during the pandemic, he went online. So it was school through the public school system. It was a portal that he logged in and he completed courses and tests and all those things. And his teachers would check in with him. But technically, that was homeschooling, even though the curriculum was being provided by the DOE in the state of Hawaii, right? And then you also have like him doing better because he wasn't getting in trouble and being crazy with his friends or whatever. So he stayed in it until he graduated. But you touched on something with the older generations, like mine. I was homeschooled starting in 1987, I think, and then all the way through the 12th grade. But we saw with those older generations, because the lack of technology, we didn't have the internet when we were starting to homeschool. And even if you did have internet, there wasn't, the same width and depth of online education sources as there are now. So it's a completely different scenario for people wanting to homeschool now. They have so many more resources at their fingertips that they can access. And some of those are through their state education and some of those are through, private curriculums that you can purchase online. But when you're talking about these alumni like myself, where your parent was just kind of winging it or they were buying curriculum from a program, there was like, and it's going back to like the fact that there's no regulations and there's no instructions and there's no oversight. When these kids like myself were graduating, we didn't have always like credits that we could show to a university. We didn't have a transcript. We didn't have a diploma. Like, that's the other side of it, is you don't understand, like, I say you, a lot of people do not understand how big of an impact this is if the kid is homeschooled all the way through the 12th grade. Because how do you graduate homeschooling? There's no cap and gown ceremony. Nobody shakes your hand and hands you the diploma. There's no one making sure you've reached all the requirements. So can you talk about like the struggles the alumni have faced when they've been homeschooled all the way through and there wasn't any connection to a state or some other party providing them a framework for how to complete schooling?
Yeah, I think that we host alumni groups a lot of at CRHE. What that does is it helps us keep centering alumni voice in this conversation, even though we work with lawmakers, we work with parents, we work across the board, but alumni will always hold the central part of our messaging and will always impact what we do the most. And in these groups, though, when we have conversations with them and we say, hey, we need to focus on some resources. What is a resource that would have helped you, will help you? The thing that always comes up is in that kind of like transition out of high school and that preparation for the real world, because you're you don't have classmates to measure up against. What I hear time and time again from alumni is they said, and maybe there was some fear of the public schools, maybe there wasn't fear of the public schools, but a lot of alumni have really internalized that feeling of not knowing where they measured up, and they would have really welcomed something like standardized testing, check-ins, so they knew that they were going to be ready for college or whatever that next step was. But there's just such a disconnect when you're not in that same environment with all your peers, knowing kind of where you measure up. So that is cited by alumni as one of the most difficult parts, I think, of homeschooling. Not to generalize, but I think it's very, very different for elementary age, right?
Right.
But when we're getting up into high school, some of that, and it's recurring for alumni. So we do a lot of work supporting them on that journey to kind of figure it out. But importantly, too, we also have to be advocating for policies that allow for, real transcripts,
Yeah.
real graduation. There are school districts across the country that allow homeschoolers to sit for AP tests. I
Nice.
love this idea
Yeah.
because you can deliver that to a university, right? You can say,
Right.
okay, maybe I don't have the full transcript, but look, Here's why I measure up. I took the AP classes. Here's my
Right.
PSAT. You can probably, a couple writing samples, you can cobble that together. But when we don't have the policies in place that support even some of those basics, it's really, really difficult for alumni to transition to college or whatever, or kind of whatever that next step is. And I think that also we've been given a lot of research, and it's not good research, but we've been given a lot of research that says homeschoolers are academically outperform everybody else. And that's challenging, I think, because it's not showing the whole picture, right?
Right.
We don't have good data about homeschooling because it's unreported, right? So even saying, yes, homeschoolers have these excellent academic outcomes, it's kind of a yes, and we don't
Mm-hmm.
know, that's a small sample of homeschoolers
Yeah.
you're pulling from. Our preliminary research and data has found that homeschoolers actually do not complete college at the same rate as their traditionally schooled peers. So there's a interesting kind of dichotomy there when you consider,
Yeah.
who's reporting any
Right.
of this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, because especially when there's no regulations
it
to
all comes
get
back to
to, yeah, like
any
so
guardrails, right?
if
Yeah.
you had 3,000 kids in a state homeschooling and only 10 of those families actually took any sort of, testing, then you don't have any data at all. Like it's not really good data to work off of. Yeah, like my mom would tell people, "Oh, she reads it at 12th grade level." But my math was always really delayed. So, of
Uh-huh.
course, she didn't tell people about that. And the other thing too is like I think people think of academics when they talk about homeschooling, but school provides so much more than just academics. Like there is a component of the social aspect, like you hinted at earlier, the jokes about homeschoolers being like really naive or really sheltered or kind of like very immature or whatnot, shy, all these different things they say, because it is true. Like if you don't have that foundation of learning how to get along with your peers, learning how to navigate, being bullied or, all these other things that can happen in a school setting, learning how to interact with. I brought this up to my friend because she had mentioned, like, oh, I just love being around my kids. Maybe I'll homeschool them. And I kind of like bit her head off. I was like, you think you can replace every single person that is inside of a school building? I was like, you're going to be the coach, you're going to be the cafeteria lady, the nurse, the principal, and the diversity that your kids are exposed to in a school setting. Like you have different races, different ethnicities, different religions. And I think that's part of why the homeschooling movement, like you said, was founded, because it is inherently racist to some degrees, that you want to keep your kids away from exposing them to all these other people that could possibly, in some remote way teach them something that you didn't want them to learn about, which is dumb because once they turn 18 and they're out of your house or they get married or they move away, they're going to learn about that stuff anyway. So it's just one of those things where I think the school systems, although they are very flawed and all we do see, of issues with school systems, they do provide more than just academics. And I think people who are homeschooling, that is a big challenge, to make sure your kid is getting social, emotional, peer relationships and things like that, because it's up to the parent to do all those things. Was the other reason I kind of told my friend, I was like, you really want to take on that responsibility of an entire school district? Like that's a lot of work for the parent, especially if you have more than one kid and you're trying to make sure that this kid's academic needs are being met and then this kid's academic needs are being met. Like in my family, my second brother had a harder time learning to read. Like me and my other brother picked it up quickly, and then my mom could just throw books at us and keep us busy. But she had to invest a lot of time and energy teaching my one brother to read, which took away from all the other kids. So there's so many things that I don't think people realize that are, lacking when it comes to homeschool, because one person just honestly cannot provide that for multiple children. But we were talking earlier about the fact that, a lot of the diversity in homeschooling is growing, and you're seeing people homeschooling for different reasons now. And we're seeing homeschooling grow in different, socioeconomic classes and different ethnicities and races. And so I know we talked a little bit before off camera about how these new homeschool families are trying to look for resources and support. And what they're coming up against is it's hyper religious. They're asking them to sign a statement of faith if they want to participate in a co op, or a support group. So can you talk a little bit about how you have helped those families and how that it's kind of a new era for homeschooling and that these people are going to be a help to your organization in the long run because they are, collaborating. Sorry, my computer unplugged itself. I may have to edit this out. But you're collaborating with them, which I think is great for the legal portion because I think that's what we need to see reform happen in our age is parents who are homeschooling who are saying, yes, please regulate me. I will sign a petition. I will talk to my congressman. I will give testimony because that's so important that these new families that are homeschooling, not for religious reasons, but for other reasons, are partnering with you all.
Yeah, I think that, and because I talk a lot about how resources serve serve children, right? They serve the adults as well, right? I mean, that's, I know that, homeschooling is such a feat and such an undertaking for these parents. These resources are available for them as well, to kind of make sure that the community truly is wrapping around the children. And that's helping, and that's helping you too. We get a lot of outreach at CRHE for people who say, I'm homeschooling for whatever the reason is. I'm the only kind of like co-op, the only network I can find in my state is religiously motivated, and I don't want that. And so, I mean, we cobble it together as best we can, but there is such a need for this because the existing homeschool institutions are so strongly religious and so strongly faith-based. Even if there's statements on their website that say, we have Christian values, but we welcome everybody.
Do they really?
It's a leap, right? And I think that, different people have different comfort levels with wherever they are in that. But, a genuine population of homeschoolers who is going to be deeply uncomfortable with signing on to some of these, religiously motivated co-ops, right? Especially if the reasons that they are homeschooling kind of go opposite of what the belief system of this homeschooling group is. And now the challenge is that's the only homeschooling resource that exists. So the more that we're able to talk about regulation, oversight, whatever word you want to use, bringing that to a state level instead of these individual co-ops is so important to really make sure we're serving all of these families. When we leave homeschooling in the hands of really specific religious communities, it's not adequately serving everyone who is actually homeschooling. So there's states like New Mexico, for example, that actually has housed within the New Mexico Department of Education. They have a specific little department, like 4 or 5 people. And what they do is not only handle like homeschool registration in the state effectively, making sure they kind of know where the kids are and what's happening, but also when a homeschooler wants to be on the football team,
Mm.
they're actually working directly with those homeschooling families and the school districts and saying, okay, how can we make this happen together? And then when families need resources, especially if their children are neurodivergent and homeschooling is a better option, a lot of times there's complementary therapies that are offered through a school system, right? So what this department does is, again, works hand in hand with both sides of that and says, all right, let's figure out how we're doing that. Now, the reason that works, right, is because it's state level, it's government, it's not religiously motivated. If we're going to give that over to a religious group, how alienating is that for families who are homeschooling because it's the best thing for their child.
Yeah, especially with what we're seeing with this backlash against the trans community and trans teens, like we saw in Oklahoma and all those other, those scenarios where the kids are needing to come out of school for their own safety and then to have no supports in the community, right? Like that's one of those
The
things.
only
I mean,
co-op, the only group you're going to
yeah,
find
yeah.
is one with a, very, very traditional Christian view.
Right, like if you've pulled your trans kid out and now the only social gathering is a bunch of evangelicals, that's not going to really work for your kid in your own safety. Yeah, I think that New Mexico is always impressing me with what they do. I'm
Mhm.
just love that state, but I think it's a really really good thing that you guys offer families is they can come to you and say, "Hey, I just pulled my kids out of school. This is why. Can you help me? Like, how can I navigate this? What are the supports? What are the resources?" Luckily, with the internet and chat groups and Reddit threads and all kinds of things, people can kind of connect internationally or nationally online, but it's not the same as like, hey, I need to know how do I build my child's transcript so that they can transfer to a college later? Or how do I get them a diploma? Like said this over and over again, there's really nothing unless you are willing to collaborate with the DOE in your state or county or wherever. You are really just left to fend for yourself. So I think you guys are providing a lot of resources to families that are in that situation.
Yeah, and what's been really great, as we meet more and more families, I love it when someone reaches out to me, phone, website, however it is, and they say, I'm in Arizona. My school district just said this. I don't think that's right. I have my really amazing homeschool mom in Arizona who I can call and say, hey, let me connect you with somebody, on the ground in your state who is actively homeschooling, understands how this works, and then, my hope is that becomes the co-op, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
and that becomes sort of that connection. But it's hard, and I feel for these families too who are sort of in this nebulous kind of in between space, and they're in states that do not support them.
Yeah.
Anti-regulation is not support, and I don't know where that sometimes gets
Yeah.
confused,
Yeah.
right? Oversight is support. That's what that is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, we talked about the child's rights and the parents' rights and all that stuff too. And I think, people think, oh, without any regulation, I can just do whatever I want. I was like, yeah, but then you have to figure it out all alone on your own. And so, um,
Yeah.
when we talked, you did touch a little bit about how globally our homeschooling statistics, the ones that we do have, are not good compared to other countries. Like I know even our public school system and our private school system compared to other countries is, not as good as many countries. But the fact that we don't have any sort of children's rights, even though, like, and this touches back into the child welfare aspect of it too, is like the mandated reporter, if your kid's not seeing a mandated reporter. But even in the United States, like, it's so loosey goosey state by state what counts as child abuse, what counts as educational neglect. Like when we're talking about homeschooling, I know for Hawaii, there was a family in my neighborhood when I lived in a different area, and the kid was not going to school. And I called and I called. And finally, on the third call, the lady was like, listen, we're never going to go out there for educational neglect. She goes, I'll just tell you right now. She goes, if the kid doesn't have a bruise or a broken bone or blood, or you don't see the mom beating them or the dad or whoever, we're not ever going to do anything about that. And I was like, great. So educational neglect, there is really no, I mean, I'm guessing, and maybe in other states it might be taken a little bit more seriously, but this is the other thing, going back to like children's rights and the UN children's rights. Can you talk a little bit about how the United States refused to sign on to this and why like other countries actually give children's rights and how that would impact what we're talking about?
Yeah. So the UN has the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we are the only country that did not sign on to that. And what the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child is just lays out as a connected group globally, really the rights that they believe children should have. And these are pretty basic, right? These are things that are outlining, you know, children deserve a safe home environment. Children deserve access to food and water. We are talking about really, really basic rights. The US remains the only country that has not signed on to that agreement. And I think it's a good thing to point to when we talk about these larger conversations around parents' rights and how we kind of keep decentering children in both the homeschooling conversation, but also in education conversations in general, right? We continue to decenter children. And I think that just shows how it is not just a new problem. It's not a unique state by state problem. This is a national sentiment that our leaders have held for a very long time. We haven't signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And a piece of that, too, is that corporal punishment is a part of that. And the United States will not remove that right from parents.
Yeah, and I think people think falsely so that spanking your child is illegal and that child welfare will get involved. But even when I was working for child welfare in the state of Oklahoma, you can spank your kids till the cows come home as long as you're not leaving marks or bruises or any type of physical reminder after, you spank them, and 30 minutes later, if there's no, physical evidence that you spanked them, there's nothing anybody's ever going to do about that. So yeah, I think that's very telling of how our nation doesn't value children, about how, how we don't see them as, like you said, it's their property. And it's pretty sad. And it kind of all ties this up in, I know we're almost out of time, but it's kind of like, how can we as citizens of the United States kind of ask our government to change this and to get involved? And I know you all have a newsletter and you have like things on your website where people can engage with you. So do you have some tips for people who want to help kids and want to give kids rights and, want to encourage their senators and Congress people to start looking into this?
Yeah, I think that the good news is, at least in terms of an advocacy conversation, is no matter what state you're in, your state can be doing better right now.
Yeah.
There is no state that we would hold up right now as the
The
emblematic.
golden standard.
Nobody's doing it right.
New Mexico, as of right now, I think is the top, as what I've heard is the best option, but even that could be improved upon.
Yeah, and that's a great example, right? New Mexico does the resources part of this really, really well, but what they don't do is they don't have any protections for children who are already involved in the CPS world. They have no additional protections for them, for their parents to pull them out of school in the middle of an active investigation. New Mexico does not have that statute. In West Virginia, this will be the third year that we're trying to pass a law called Rayleigh's Law that says that if families have an active and substantiated CPS investigation open, they cannot change the child's school status. It's been struck down twice. We're trying again, but it's really hard. And I bring that up just to say, there are these direct advocacy opportunities that happen state by state. And when people are able to plug into us, I love sharing the opportunities, and they happen in a couple different ways. Sometimes they happen because there's a really, really terrible case that breaks in the media of extreme child abuse and neglect. Homeschooling is central to that story, and that kind of stirs up lawmakers. But the other thing is that has happened enough now in enough states across the country that if someone is motivated enough to reach out to their own legislators, and legislators it's not just your state senator or your house representative. It's also all the people that work in your state's Department of Education. It's even your local school board. Everybody has a stake in this because of how we approach, or we don't approach, right? That's probably a better way, because of how we don't approach homeschooling. So if people are motivated, sometimes all it takes is framing for these elected officials. Hey, you've got a loophole in your policy here. It's gone really badly in other states. I don't want it to happen again.
Or it's already happened here.
Or it's already happening, right? So here's how you can do it. So if people are motivated to talk to their local elected officials, I am happy to support those conversations. A lot of times people just CC me in on it, and I will take it from there.
Nice.
And make sure that we're following up and that we're doing everything like that. But the other piece that our organization does that we'd like people to be kind of in concert with us too is that we're trying to really productively engage in the larger homeschooling conversation. So we have a tremendous team of researchers who, the majority are homeschool alumni as well, all studying education, but they're doing some really great research on what really are some of these homeschooling outcomes.
Yeah.
We also love it when people have opportunities for us to talk, even like this is great too, because it reaches more and more people who maybe even didn't consider homeschooling. Again, it used to be just a very, very tiny little percentage, but as more and more children are homeschooled, if there's ever opportunities to, share the stories that we share, or if there's opportunities for us to talk about homeschooling, that is so valuable in moving this conversation forward. Because there's a lot more homeschoolers than people think there are.
Yeah, and that's how I originally found you guys, because I was kind of in an uproar and I was like, there's got to be somebody out there who can help me about this situation that I'm really upset about. And then I found you guys have a database of alumni testimonials where if you are a homeschooler, you can submit your story, the good, bad, and the ugly, and you guys keep it in a database. And that information is used for these purposes, like, creating awareness and education and kind of telling the story. And also, if there's things that come up, you can show lawmakers and policymakers like, hey, look, these are the stories of the kids who've come through the homeschooling system in your state. And this is what they're saying about their experience. So, if anybody who's listening or is watching on YouTube has had an experience with homeschooling, please reach out to you all at CRHE, and I'll link all the the information in the show notes to get in contact with you, because I think the work you guys are doing is so important. And I think it's going to continue to be important as we see the way our country's heading in the next few years. And people will probably continue to increase homeschooling, I would see, because of what's, the safety issues we're seeing for people.
Yeah, I see no world or reason where homeschooling is going to shrink. And so
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, the more that people can help us talk about homeschooling now will improve the outcomes for all of the children who are going to be homeschooled, and make sure that they, especially the ones who really need to be homeschooled, that they have all those resources, have all that access. Yeah, and I also encourage alumni too, if you're interested in kind of just plugging into an alumni community. For me in this job, that has been my favorite part of this job, is finding so many people with a shared experience. And even
Yeah.
though I'm nearly 20 years past homeschooling,
Yeah.
it was still a pivotal part of my childhood, and
Yeah.
I love that I can joke about homeschooling now with other
Yeah,
homeschoolers.
it's when I've attended you guys' things or talked with you or watched your stuff, it's always like this feeling of like, "Oh, it wasn't just me." And I reading, I think it was the Educated book by the woman out of Utah, I believe, or not sure, was it Wyoming? Her book was Oprah had her book on, and I'll link that book as well. It's a really good resource. And then I know like Jeanette McCurdy is an actress who was Mormon and was homeschooled. And so when you hear these stories, you're like, oh, I wasn't the only one who had this really weird, alienating, isolating experience. And so to be able to connect with someone who has the similar experience to you is super valuable and super helpful, especially as we navigate, like I did find my way through college and I did get a degree and it was weird and hard and embarrassing at times, to be able to somebody who is trying to navigate that, to support each other and help each other. I think that's so valuable, what the work you all are doing. And I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to me. And yeah, I will link all the things for you all, CRHE, in the show notes. And is there anything else you want to share with people before we go?
No, thank you for letting me talk about homeschool policy. It's my favorite it's my favorite thing to talk about, and I can keep going. But yeah, no, just thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit, and the opportunity to get the word out about homeschooling and just the current nature of it. And yeah, I am really excited for, I think, some of the legislative change that, fingers crossed, we will see this year and next year, but it's all good stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tess. You have a good day. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching, and we'll see you again next time.